3 dark and disturbing historical cases. Have you ever thought about what might be hiding in the darker parts of history? This movie shows 3 of the scariest and most upsetting crimes that have ever happened in public. From the panic that led to the Salem witch trials to Jack the Ripper's horrible killings and the unimaginable horrors of the Nanking Massacre. These stories will make you think about how cruel people can be and what we can learn from these terrible events. Are you ready to look into the dark parts of our past? Read on to learn more. It is common for history to be idealized, and it is replete with stories of bravery, discovery, and advancement. In spite of this, stories of darkness, violence, and profound unrest can be found beneath the surface of human progress. The accounts in question serve as jarring reminders of the extent to which humans are capable of cruelty and the depths to which they can go. This video examines 3 such examples, each of which is distinguished by the terrible severity of the events that transpired and the lasting impact that they had on society. Number 3. The massacre that took place in Nanking. The Nanking Massacre, also known as the Rape of Nanking, is one of the worst tragedies in contemporary history. In the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese Imperial Army conquered Nanking, China's capital, on December 13, 1937, initiating this 6-week tragedy. Massacre's enormity and cruelty stunned the globe and shaped 20th century history. China-Japan War escalated in the 1930s. Before Nanking fell, the Japanese had seized Shanghai in a deadly war. The fall of Nanking was inevitable, but the massacre was shocking. Japanese soldiers terrorized and destroyed Chinese soldiers and people upon entering the city. Japanese forces often executed Chinese soldiers and civilians. Death tolls ranging from 100,000 to over 300,000. These executions often used mass gunfire or bayonets and swords. Surrendered Chinese soldiers were often burnt alive or used for bayonet practice. The victims and their descendants were traumatized by the extent and inhumanity of the killings. Sexual assault by Japanese soldiers was one of the worst features of the Nanking Massacre. This time saw 20,000 to 80,000 women raped, including 8-year-olds and elderly women. The attack victims were typically brutally murdered to erase witnesses. Sexual violence humiliated victims and terrorized the population. Many of these women and their families have suffered in silence for decades because of the trauma they suffered. Along with widespread executions and rapes, Japanese soldiers stole and burnt huge areas of the city. The destruction of homes, businesses, and cultural institutions left many civilians homeless and poor. The city's infrastructure was destroyed, worsening survivors' misery. The city was destroyed and its people depressed by looting and arson. The Nanking Safety Zone was founded by a few Western missionaries, doctors, and merchants in Nanking. Despite the zone's officials' inability to avert crimes, hundreds of Chinese citizens sought safety here. The bravery and humanity of foreigners like German merchant John Rabe and American missionary Minnie Vautrin are recalled. They documented the crimes and gave vital relief, but the violence continued. The safety zone administrators and other foreigners in Nanking reported the massacre to the international community. These stories, photos, and videos proved the horrors. Many nations were engaged with political and military issues on the brink of World War II. Thus, the global response was modest. Nanking victims were left alone due to international inaction. In the aftermath of World War II, the IMTFE and Nanking War Crimes Tribunal tried Japanese officials and soldiers for war crimes. Some culprits were executed, but many were never caught. The trials were a step toward accountability, but they did not address the entire extent of the atrocities or the need for justice and reconciliation. Sino-Japanese relations remain tense over the Nanking Massacre. Some Japanese leaders and residents have apologized for the atrocities, but others have downplayed or denied them, exacerbating diplomatic tensions. Victims and their descendants still feel anguish about the massacre. Nanking Massacre Memorial Hall is one of many memorials and museums in China. These memorials and schools remember the victims and teach the lessons of this tragic episode. The Nanking Massacre illustrates war's horrors and human depravity. It emphasizes historical memory, justice, and reconciliation after atrocities. We may reduce catastrophes like the Nanking Massacre by remembering and understanding them. This tragic chapter in history reminds us of our humanity and the need to safeguard human rights even in wartime. Number 2. The murders committed by Jack the Ripper. Since the beginning of a string of gruesome killings in the Whitechapel neighborhood of London in the autumn of 1888, the neighborhood was engulfed in fear. The serial killer, also known as Jack the Ripper, preyed upon low-income women, the majority of whom were employed in the sex industry. In order to carry out his horrible method of operation, he would first slice the necks of his victims, and then proceed to mutilate their bodies with a knife. Jack the Ripper is most generally linked with the following 5 victims: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. These victims are considered to be canonical victims. The final victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was particularly horrifyingly disfigured, reflecting the fact that each subsequent murder was more violent than the one that came before it. In spite of the efforts that they made, the Metropolitan Police were not successful in capturing Jack the Ripper. It was extremely challenging to conduct the inquiry since there was a lack of forensic science available at the time. In addition to the chaotic and overcrowded conditions that existed in Whitechapel, a wide variety of suspects were put forward, including butchers and doctors from the neighborhood, as well as members of the royal family of the United Kingdom. On the other hand, none of them were positively recognized as the Jack the Ripper. There have been innumerable books, films, and ideas that have been inspired by the Jack the Ripper case, which has had a long-lasting impact on popular culture. The enormous social inequities that existed during that time period were brought to light, as were the vulnerability of the urban poor. It is certain that this terrible chapter will continue to be a matter of interest and discussion for a long time to come, since the mystery that surrounds the identity of Jack the Ripper continues to captivate the imagination of the general public. Number 1. The Salem Witch Trials. Salem, Massachusetts, a small Puritan hamlet, became the setting for one of the most notorious witch hunts in the history of the world in the latter half of the 17th century. There were 20 people put to death as a result of the Salem Witch Trials, which took place between the years 1692 and 1693. The majority of those who were put to death were women. Many more were imprisoned. In January of 1692, a number of young girls in Salem village began displaying odd behaviors, such as fits, cries, and contortions. This was the beginning of the terror that ensued. Having been unable to identify a physical cause, the local physician speculated that the girls were under the influence of a spell. Tituba, a slave from the Caribbean, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an old widow, were among the local women who were accused of practicing witchcraft by the girls. They were subjected to tremendous pressure and interrogation from the authorities. A mixture of dread, superstition, and personal vendettas were the driving forces behind the charges, which swiftly spiraled out of control and became out of control. 20 individuals were sentenced to death by hanging after the court relied on spectral evidence, which is testimony that the ghost or specter of the accused was seen engaging in witchcraft while they were in the courtroom. In particular, Giles Corey, who had refused to make a plea, was put to death by being pounded to death with large stones. When the frenzy finally dissipated, the community was left to deal with the repercussions of the actions it had taken. Following the conclusion of the trials, a significant number of the main persons involved in the proceedings expressed sorrow, and the Massachusetts General Court ultimately ruled that the trials were invalid. Despite the passage of time, the Salem witch trials continue to serve as a vivid illustration of the perils of mass hysteria, scapegoating, and the violation of due process. The Salem witch trials, the murders committed by Jack the Ripper, and the Nanking Massacre are all examples of distinct aspects of human evil. These stories shed light on the depths to which humanity is capable of sinking, ranging from the perils of frenzy and scapegoating to the horrors of serial murder and the atrocities of war. In our never-ending efforts to create a better world, they serve as sobering reminders of the importance of maintaining vigilance, striving for justice, and showing compassion. By learning about and remembering these tragic chapters of history, we can get a deeper understanding of the intricacies of human nature and work toward preventing catastrophes of this kind from happening in the future. If you found this video compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most fascinating and chilling events. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update.